Hey guys, today's oil painting tutorial is about the topic how to paint fur with oils. Today I'm painting on Arche oil painting paper. The texture is rather rough, it is cold pressed and has a 300 grams. You don't have to prime it, you can just paint on it right away. For me, after having painted my little study, I probably wouldn't use it again because the texture was a bit rough and it requires me to use a lot of oil paint or very fluid oil paint. So yeah, it really depends. It's not bad, you can really paint very well on it, but the texture is a little bit too much for my taste, but otherwise the paper is very good. Then my medium that I'm using is Green for Oil from Sennelier, and this was the first time that I used this medium, and yeah, I won't use it again, my friends. The good thing is that it is non-toxic and it is easy to use, but the bad thing is that it takes forever to dry. Although it says that it reduces drying time, it's really not doing a lot for me. So normally I'm using Liquin Original, and I recommend that if you don't want to wait weeks for your oil painting to dry. So my little study, it is in the studio already 3 days and the painting is completely wet, like nothing had dried yet. So yeah, I don't recommend that if you are going for a faster drying time. Otherwise, if you have a lot of time, you can use that because it is non-toxic and it doesn't have a strong smell, so that's a very good thing about it. Then for cleaning my brushes, I'm using refined safflower oil from Jackson's Art. It doesn't really clean the brushes very well, so it's more like a mixture between, or a blend between, an oil paint medium and a brush cleaner. So you can just use that alone for your oil paint, for your oil paintings, but it also doesn't really dry quickly. So I use normally the refined safflower oil and Liquin Original. I switched from Gamsol to safflower oil because safflower oil is absolutely non-toxic. You can work very well on details with it. So in comparison to Gamsol, it doesn't dissolve any details you have painted on your canvas or paper before. So this is super. It really preserves the paint well when you paint it. On the bad side, it doesn't really clean your brushes at all, so you have to really use a lot of oil to get some oil paint out of your brush. So I just try to use more brushes because I don't really get them clean, or I use a lot of oil to get them clean, and after my painting session I have to clean all my brushes with soap. So this is a little bit annoying, but on the other hand it is non-toxic and it has no smell at all. So this is my current preferred brush cleaner, or oil, or how you want to say it. And here comes my palette. I use Titanium White from Bösner Studio or Schminke Norma, Ultramarine Blue, Cypress Blue, Cadmium Yellow Lemon, Yellow Ochre, Magenta and Burnt Sienna from Schminke Norma, Chrome Oxy Green, Permanent Red Violet and Ivory Black from Rembrandt, and Naples Yellow Warm from Sennelier. So Rembrandt and Sennelier are quite expensive brands. You don't have to use them. I just use them because I paint for such a long time, and I'm also sharing my paints with my boyfriend, so it we can afford like the more expensive ones, it's no problem. But if you're just doing it for a hobby, or you just are on a budget, you can totally use like student grade oil paint. For example, my titanium white from Bösner Studio is student grade. It's not such a big difference, as long as your oil paint has a very, like, is properly pigmented. you can pretty much use it. So don't feel that you have to buy the exact same colors that I do. Also, like, I could use a completely different set of colors here. It's just that I have those colors that I use more regularly, but oftentimes I switch the colors. So really, this is maybe just a guideline, so don't feel that you have to buy these exact same colors. I changed the reference photo that I used for this little study from a more realistic palette to a rather like colorful and false color palette that I really like. I replaced the black tones with dark blue tones. And now let's finally start with the tutorial. I started off with filling in the darkest parts of the painting first. In this case, all the darkest parts are this violet blue. So in order to achieve this tone, I mix permanent red violet and ultramarine blue. My strategy for painting fur is that I really rigorously start with the darkest parts, then continue with the next mid-tone and then the next lighter tone, and so on until I reach the white tones of the painting. And the reason is that with every brush stroke I try to mimic the shape of the fur. So currently you're not seeing it yet because I'm just filling out the nose, the eyes and the mouth portion, but you will see it soon enough. Also, I switched from my small brush to the flat Tosh brush that I use for almost all my paintings. The advantage with this flat brush is that I can paint very fine details with one edge of the brush, and I can also fill in a larger part with the other like shape of the brush. So it's super useful, and I can also make very sharp edges. And here you see the technique that I was talking about. So I try to mimic the dynamic of the fur. So with every brush stroke I try to make fur, and I draw like one long or short line and try to make it look like hair, instead of maybe trying to add individual hairlines or like little details. All of that comes later. In the beginning part, I'm starting off with the dark tones, because later on I can place in these darker areas the midtones. And here you see me already mixing the next mid-tone on the palette. So this little red panda has this nice, this pretty red, like pink coat, because since I changed the color a little bit, it looks almost pinkish, orangey, so very vibrant. And for that I'm mixing cadmium red light and permanent red violet to get this tone. And here I'm already demonstrating that technique. So I'm drawing my brush into those darker areas. Currently we only have the neck area that is already there, where we could draw the brush strokes in, but later on you will see that we have a lot of areas where I can do this technique. Wherever I haven't put down any fur yet, I'm just starting with those brush strokes that indicate any hair, and I'm just drawing them in the direction that I see on my reference photo. For example, along his eyes, like this little pattern there, I draw the brush strokes a little bit to the top, and then around his like neck I just draw the brush strokes in a whirl motion. So so that I can come with my brush from the other side and draw the next mid-tone into those dark areas. And here you see me also struggling with the paper, because it has such a rough surface that all my brush strokes are rough too. So normally when I paint on paper it's very smooth, and all the brush strokes look very beautiful. However, here every brush strokes look like a dry brush technique that wasn't intended. I still managed to make a nice study. It was just a little bit annoying because I had to change the consistency of my oil paint to a very fluid and almost watercolory like consistency. Maybe not as fluid like as watercolor, maybe like very fluid acrylic paint. Depending on which surface you paint, you will anyways have to change your consistency. On canvas I have a different consistency of paint, or I prefer a different one than on paper. You will see it when you get experience with painting, what works best for you. Here I'm going onto the larger areas of his fur, and it is very important that you use a large brush here. I personally like it a lot when you fill in large areas with large brush and small areas with small brushes, because otherwise it looks very messy and you don't really have control over like how the entire area will look. If you have a large brush, you can use only a couple of really strong and like very expressive brush strokes, and they look very beautiful. If you use a small brush, then you have to use tons and tons of brush strokes, and it might not look as painterly and as good as it would look with a large brush stroke. This is my opinion. But of course there are so many different techniques, and this is just the one that I really prefer. Okay, and here I have already put down some of the fur on his back, and on his neck, for example, I draw the brushes onto the top of the paper where the hair touches the sky, so that then I can from the other side go into this like hair portion from the other side and draw like and generate this fur like effect there, but you will see later on. There also the shadow beneath his neck. I also already drew in some of the larger brush strokes into the shadow area, and there you see how beautiful the red already blends with the blue, so it already looks a little bit like you can see individual hair strands there. So I'm carefully like drawing the red into the blue area. And all the time I'm making sure that I have enough color on my paint, on my brush. And here you see how I just draw the individual like strands of fur like along his body. And since I'm using this large brush, I don't really have to mix, or I have to go so often times over my painted area, only a couple of times. And when I go, like, I try to go as few times as possible over those like border areas. I call those border areas where like one paint touches the other paint, like the red, for example, touches the blue. I try to go like as few times as possible over these areas, because like the first 2 or 3 brush strokes, there generally you generate the most beautiful look and effect, and after that it just get a little bit smudgy and blurry and it's not that beautiful. So I try to really use only a few brush strokes here. Since the red that I used was a little bit too extreme, I added in some of the magenta tone from Schmincke and continued there on his head. Since the cadmium red light and the permanent red violet are super dominant and super high pigmented, the magenta can't really be seen, so I just added them on the white areas on his face. There you can see those pink tones a little bit better. Also, all my magenta tones are transparent, like magenta and permanent red violet. So the best way to apply them on your canvas is on a white background. When you paint them on a darker background, the color beneath will show through and you will probably not see the pink very much. So I try to use light backgrounds when I use transparent colors. Blue is a transparent one, black not. Black, for example, is very opaque. White is kind of opaque too, but every color is different. Okay, so back to the fur areas. Here you see me using a smaller brush, but I use the same technique here. So with this flat, smaller brush, I'm following the fur portions on his head. And since my strategy is from dark to light, I'm just applying this, applied this red wherever I could find it on my reference. For example, you have a little bit between the ears, you have a little bit on the right side of his face. And now I continue with the next tone. And the next tone is this dark bluish and like ochre kind of color that you see on the right side. So the right side of his head is in the shadows, so I'm going to start there before I add any lighter tones on his head. Since the fur there is quite difficult, we have like different variations. It looks a little bit like marble. So we have red fur, and then next to it is ochre. So I just don't want to bother with that. Instead, I just squint my eyes and see, okay, I'm going to mix this kind of bluish, like almost like flesh tone, and then I'm adding some of those fur strands there. So with my flat brush, I'm drawing a diagonal line from the ear to his, or like more, like not one, instead like a lot of diagonal fur lines from his ear to his eye, so that I can a little bit mimic this marble shape, a marble like pattern, and then like later on I can maybe add more of the red, like individual red hair, so that it looks a little bit patchy like it does on the reference photo. And I don't currently I'm not paying a super lot of attention to getting it exactly as a reference. The focus is to get a nice fur effect here. So whenever I draw my brush stroke, I try to make like I try to think whenever I use a brush stroke. So for example, here I'm carefully adding working on the border of his face where his forehead touches his ear. There I want the two to be separated, so I'm carefully there. And then when we come to the eye, I can draw this white line into the like red paint that I like, the red pattern on her eye. And the good thing with this technique, like drawing every brush stroke into previously color, into paint that you have added previously, is that you have automatically this fur effect. So all your paint will automatically get mixed and a little bit like blended into each other, and you already have something that resembles fur. Very important is whenever you draw a lighter tone into a darker tone, is that you clean your brush after pretty much every brush stroke, which is very time consuming. And you already see that my lint-free cotton towel is super dirty already, so I have to turn it a couple of times during my painting session because I have to like clean my brush all the time. And here you see me adding a little bit of the blue onto his ears. I changed all the white or the darker whites of my reference photo into this beautiful like blue tone, and to mix this kind of very vibrant turquoise, I used Sevros blue from Schminke because it has this really beautiful turquoise tone, or you can also use cobalt blue and add white into it, then you get this light tone. Here I'm trying to clean my brush and add more of these whites. Also with the ears, I'm very carefully, I draw the paint from the outside to the inside. So I can still work on the edges when I do the background. So the important thing is here to get a nice blending from the like borders of the ears to the inner shadow areas, the like dark inside of the ear. And there I'm just carefully drawing those brush strokes into the dark areas. Interesting is that this technique is quite similar to the technique when I draw lilies, for example. It's pretty much the same. I draw from the outside to the inside to get this blending effect between the dark and the light. Yeah, so the cool thing is, if you know one technique, you can use it a lot for other objects that you want to paint. So it's a very useful technique. Here I am working on the blending between his forehead and the like dark areas around his like the pattern on his head. And there I'm just changing the angle of my brush carefully. So I want to have this kind of like fountain effect, like it looks a little bit as if the white and the midtones on his forehead like form a fountain and then blend into the darker area. I know it sounds really crude, but I didn't know how to describe it differently. So in order to get that, I changed the angle of my brush whenever I touch the dark area. And here, for example, at the top of his forehead, I just follow the lines, like the dynamic lines of his head. Sometimes it's also maybe a matter of experience or just your own preferences in which direction you want the fur to go. I would recommend that you definitely change the direction, but not like totally wildly, otherwise your animal will probably look very like wild and maybe weird. So maybe alter the angles a couple of times when you draw the fur. Don't draw them just only in one direction, then it would look weird too, but also don't make it too crazy. So this would be probably my recommendation for it. Since I have already had this blue on my brush, I continued on the other blue areas on his face. So you see that the panda already come together beautifully, and all the different colors look also very nice. So you have the different blue tones there, you have the green and the ochre tones, like they are kind of a variation of gray blue, and I really like to use a lot of colors when I paint fur because then it looks more natural. Also what I do here is I use the flat brush to add some individual red strings, like hair strands, into the fur. Like I earlier said, it looks a little bit like marble, and since that is too complicated to paint, I just add some individual hair strands on top of it, like at the end of the process or in the middle, probably at that moment when I have the paint on my brush. And here with this green, with its green tone, I'm just looking on my reference where I can find some of the details. Also, we have here this little red details around his eyes, almost like his eyebrows. And here, of course, I'm a little bit more careful. So I try to be more like concentrated in which direction I tilt the brush angle so that it looks more accurate. So whenever you paint larger areas, you don't have to be as super accurate, and maybe not when you paint the ears, but especially the eye portion, eyebrows, nose and mouth, I'm just a little bit more concentrated and try to get the exact angle so that it looks like an actual face and it looks like a little bit more symmetrical and not too wild and weird. Here I'm working on the light area of his face. For this color I mixed yellow ochre, a little bit of the lemon yellow, a little bit of blue and white. I pretty much wanted this weird yellow brown color, and I also alternate the color, so I don't just mix one color. I mix this ochre color, add a little bit of the cadmium red light, this bright orange to it, and then I add some of the paint on the right side of his face into this area that looks a little bit like marble. So everything gets some bits of this paint, and you generate a patchwork of different individual like little fur strands, and it looks very nice. If you'd only have like a couple of colors, sometimes the effect isn't that interesting and doesn't look that good, especially if you have an animal that has a lot of colors. Some animal, if you want paint a white bunny, then you obviously don't have as much different paint or colors that you have maybe with a leopard or maybe with another animal with more like different fur. And here I'm continuing with the blue part on his nose, on his snout. So for this I'm mixing the Sephora blue, but it's a little bit too intense, so I'm just adding a bit of brown and ultramarine blue in it and tiny bit of black. This is useful to just get it a little bit more grayish and take out some of the vibrancy. And again, on this area I have to be a bit more careful because I'm working on the eyes, and the eyes are currently just those little blobs of paint where I added just this ultramarine blue and permanent red violet, so it's just a blob. And here I'm shaping the eyes, so it is a little bit difficult to change the shape of the eye from the inside. So working with the dark tones against the white tones is more difficult because the dark tones are transparent and the white tones are very opaque. So the best thing is to make the dark tones first and then try to carefully shape those little areas like the eyes with the whiter tones, in this case this blue. Here I'm just adding the blue everywhere on the painting where I find it. Here on the eyes, of course, I have to be careful again. And I'm having red on my brush, so I'm just like working on some details here. For example, here on the right side on his face, or there on the pattern under his eye. The more I kind of arrive at the final stages of my painting, I'm just a little bit more cautious and try to get the look on his face right. Especially with animals, it's not super easy because they look so different from humans that it's like very different to paint. Here with the smaller brush, I can add a lot of those strings, and I can add some details here and there and just correct some of the things before I continue with the white areas. Whenever I see a mistake in the beginning stages, I definitely work on that before I add like the larger areas, because then you can't really do a lot then after you have added a lot of paint, so it's good to make it in the beginning. Here I am approximately happy, so I'm proceeding to the larger areas, and here I'm mixing a blue-gray tone for the white area in his face. And again, I'm very careful to draw the fur into the direction that I wanted. For example, in this case, I draw it from the inside to the outside because everything that borders this white area is darker, and I have to be careful that my white stays white. So after every brush stroke I clean my brush and then I start from the inside to the outside. And the same with his snout too. So starting in the inside of his snout, and then I continue to the outside and draw every brush stroke like until it borders the next color or touches the next color. Here where it touches fur, I can draw the brush a little bit longer, and where it touches his snout, of course I don't want to draw it into his snout because the snout is skin. On the tip of his snout, the nose is skin, and I don't want it to have a fur effect, obviously. The same color I can use for his ears, so I can just look how beautiful. I can just draw the outside of his ears into the red midtone. It looks so nice. This is the effect that I really love. It looks already like fur, and you don't have to do so much. You don't have to make an individual hair strand. You can just make those like some brush strokes, and it looks already like fur. And now I just fill out the rest of his face. Again, here I'm using this white grayish blue tone and just fill in this area below his ear where you have this white stripe, and there I just try to get a nice blending too. Then I just work on his cheek again and on his forehead, and try to mix this kind of brown tone there, because it's not actually this white. You have a lot of different ochre, brown and beige tones there. So here I use the small edge of my brush to add some individual hair strands, and this effect I do in the last stages of the painting process. So in the first stages I like to get all the larger areas done to build up the shadows and to get the color values right, and then in the end I add those details and add individual hair strands. So I'm working from big to small. I find this way like the easiest technique when I paint those animals with a lot of fur. Here I'm mixing this blue tone and work on his snout again. The snout is rather rough, so I have to work on some of the details there, and also on his eyes. Like, they have no shape anymore, so I have to get those eyes right. Also, again, whenever I have a specific paint on my brush, I look on my reference where I can find this paint, and then I add it. For example, this gray tone I added not only on his snout but also some areas on his forehead. And here I'm working on the blending between the light area on his snout and the darker areas. Here I'm trying to get a clean brush, and after every brush stroke I clean my brush. So you see, like, I do one stripe of white or light blue and then I clean the brush again. So like here I'm cleaning the brush again, then I'm adding another stripe and then another stripe. And yeah, so here in this area I didn't have to clean the brush that much, but whenever I touch a darker area I have to do that. Also, for the smaller portions of his face, obviously I use the smaller brush, but I would never use a pointed tip brush. Like, I cannot work with them when I paint fur. It's like not possible. The advantage with those flat brushes, but not with all, but with the ones that I use, is that they are relatively stiff. So they give you a lot of like standing. Like when you draw a line, it's stiff and it stays like that. So when you have a pointed tip brush, or you have like what I do here with the pointed tip brush is just adding, like, working on the eyes and make the shape interesting, make the shape right, and also work on the border. So I use the pointed tip brush to make the border a little bit more smoother and not have the color like stacked on top, and then you have those ugly lines. So what I wanted to say was the flat brush. So when they are stiff, you get stability, and you can make fur and hair strands so much more better as with a flat brush that is not that stiff. I have a lot of soft flat brushes and I can't really work with them on fur or on hair. So make sure you have kind of stiffness, and if you don't know if this is the right brush, just test it out. Test and see if you can make good lines with it and if you get some stability with the brush. So yeah, it's just, I didn't learn it, so I just kind of noticed it after a lot of painting. So you will probably see that too after a lot of painting, that you will notice with which brushes work for you and which don't. So here I'm just using white and work out some of the kinks here and make the panda look more like the reference photo. Especially around the eyes, I want more details. The problem with this alla prima painting and also with the paper is that because the paper was so rough, I had to use so much oil paint. In this case, I just mixed my oil paint with a lot of the medium and the oil so that I had a fluent consistency. But the disadvantage of this is that you can't really correct a lot. So after the first layer of paint, you're pretty much done with it. You can't correct a lot of things. You can, like I did with the fur, I can add like some blendings, but I can't really correct a lot of things. So this is really bad. So when you are not that experienced with oil paint, I would recommend not this paper to you, instead maybe a canvas which is rather smooth, so that you can stack more oil paint on top. So the more oil paint you can stack on top of each other, the more like tries you have to correct and to make mistakes so that you can correct them and alter them. When you have only one try, it's a little bit annoying because then you have to wait until it's dried, and this paper takes forever to dry. Like, it's already 3 days ago and still not dried. I don't know, maybe it takes 2 weeks. Like, I cannot recommend this oil paint medium at all. Okay, here I am correcting some of the blendings and I'm adding some individual hair strands into his forehead. So this is something I do at the end because I still want to have some like little hair strands. I don't like to make those kind of paintings where you see like every single hair strand because I think it's just too much. Instead, I like to add like I do those larger like parts, and then at the end I add some individual hair strands, just like highlights. Here I'm working on background, and when I've finished the background I go back to the animal again, and he has this bamboo behind him, so I'm starting with the bamboo. You can also start with the background, let it dry, and then add the bamboo on top, but I was impatient and I wanted to have everything finished in only one session, which is the great thing with alla prima. But you have to plan, so you have to look on your reference where you find which colors. And this background is a little bit like you have some different blobs of colors there, some green, some brown, so I'm just adding those. And I will also make sure when I paint the background to also make the edges of the panda better. So the goal is to make it look like fur. So whenever I touch the border of his face or his body, I have to be careful to make a good edge, but I will show that to you in a moment. To get a very good edge, you have to use the exact same amount of paint. You mustn't use too much paint and not too few paint, so it has to be exactly the right amount. And also with the bamboo leaves, so when you use too much paint you get a very ugly and thick border, and if you don't use enough, you just have this dry brush effect, and if it won't get opaque, so you don't get an edge at all. Yeah, and this is what I do. So I also change the color of the background, and I make sure to use the larger brush for the larger areas. It gets so much faster than the painting process. If I would use the small brush that you see here for the larger areas, it just takes too long. So I use the small brush here for the details, because otherwise I can't get into all these small edges there between the leaves. So obviously for that I'm using a small brush. After I have filled out all the background parts, I worked on refining the animal again. So here I'm adding some of the individual hair strands on his back because I can see them on the reference, and also I want to have just some more details there in this large red area. And I'm also working just on some little things on the painting that maybe I'm not super happy with, but at this stage of the painting I can't do that much. So the only thing that I can do is maybe work on some blendings and make some edges better, but I wouldn't be able to make major changes. So due to the alla prima and the thickness of the paint, yeah, I'm limited to making small changes, but I can work on edges. Whenever I see an edge which is too thick, so whenever I had used too much oil paint, then I can take a dry brush and go over this edge, make it a little bit more smooth and take away some of the color. Here I'm working on his eyes, and this was a little bit difficult because the white was very thick and the eyes were also, like, the paint was very thick and transparent, so it was almost impossible to still work on them. So what I did is just take a small pointed brush and then a dry clean brush, and just carefully go over the edge to make the edges of the eyes at least like tidying it up a bit. And that's it for the panda. I did add some individual hair strands and with the pointed tip, so this was my very last step there, and I added some like those highlights which just make it a little bit more interesting. What you can do to make a better looking study even is to let everything dry and then go over individual areas again and work them out. Maybe the eyes, maybe some areas of the fur, but not everything. So this way you can get an even better study. So this one was just like a quick alla prima study that took me, I don't know, 2 hours maybe, something like that, or 3 hours. And yeah, so I'm happy with the result, and I hope I could teach you my fur painting technique, although of course it's not perfect in this little study. But as I said, when you put more time and effort into it and maybe use 2 layers or maybe even 3, you will get a beautiful animal out of it. Yeah, I hope you found it helpful, and let me know what you think about this tutorial, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye!